Good morning, everyone, or good day, wherever you are around the world, and welcome to the Brookings Institution's event today on U.S.-Pakistan relations. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program, and I'm joined today by a distinguished panel, a conversation I'll be moderating before we take your questions. And I'll introduce each of the panelists in just a second, but as you can see on your screens, they include Ambassador Richard Olson and my colleagues at Brookings, Medea Afzal and Bruce Rydell, a distinguished trio with a lot of experience and background in South Asia and in certainly U.S. foreign policy making as well. I think everyone tuning in is undoubtedly aware of the importance of Pakistan, but it's worth reiterating because it's sometimes been called the most dangerous country in the world, given the combination of burgeoning population, nuclear weapons, extremist groups operating on its territory, some of those extremist groups being the creation, even if now perhaps sometimes the Frankenstein's monster of the Pakistani security forces that may or may not have full control over them, groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba that carried out the 2008 Mumbai tragedy. In addition, of course, we are now at a point where the United States and NATO have left Afghanistan, fundamentally changing the geostrategic picture and the way in which the United States can assess its interests and opportunities in South Asia. And all of that happens, of course, in the context of new geopolitical developments in other directions, including a strengthening Pakistan-China relationship, strengthening US-India relationship over the years, and of course, Russia always a player as well. So that's the basic context. We'd like to take stock of where US-Pakistan relations are today and what opportunities may arise in the future. It's not exactly an easy moment. To some extent, one could say that the defeat of the NATO mission in Afghanistan was, at least partly in American eyes anyway, a result of Pakistan's frenemy behavior, where in some ways they cooperated with us in the mission, allowing logistics and supplies to go through Pakistani ports and ground lines of communication, but also tolerated the Taliban leadership acting and operating off of their soil, which of course was much of why the war never could be brought to a successful conclusion in terms of counterinsurgency. So that's the frame. Now let me please just say a word each about our panelists and then get to their opening thoughts. I'm going to ask them some general questions. So we'll conduct this in conversational format, spend about a half hour talking amongst ourselves, and then look forward to your questions, which you could still submit if you wish at events@brookings.edu. The email again, events@brookings.edu. Rick Olson retired from the Foreign Service in 2016 after a distinguished career of some 34 years. He joined the Foreign Service in 1982. He had a lot of experience in many parts of the world, including several countries in Africa. But his Middle East credentials are certainly, Middle East and South Asia credentials are certainly among the most notable for today's discussion, including an ambassadorship in Pakistan, and including also having been one of the several ambassadors present in the US mission in Kabul just before that. So that's how he concluded his career and certainly saw the US-Pakistan relationship from up front and was a key part of that relationship through some difficult times. Medea Afzal is a David Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings, one of our brightest and most promising scholars. She attended the University of Lahore in Pakistan, and also Yale University in the United States. So certainly has as good a vantage point on both countries at issue today as anybody I know, and wrote an excellent book several years ago, Pakistan Under Siege. And Bruce Rydell is, simply put, one of the most accomplished Americans of his generation, both as a government expert, a CIA veteran, and a Brookings scholar now of almost 15 years, during which time he's written half a dozen books, including on the US-Pakistan relationship, including on the broader terrorism challenge in the region, and as well the US-Saudi relationship, and most recently, the US-Jordan relationship, a book that's just come out in the last couple of weeks and which I recommend extremely highly to everyone. So thank you for your indulgence in letting me go through that warm-up and that introduction. And now we'll get to the real experts. And Ambassador Olson, thank you for joining us today. If I could begin with you, just if you could situate us in the moment in this momentous year of 2021, where you see US-Pakistan relations in the immediate aftermath of the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Delighted to be with this excellent panel this morning. Let me start by saying that, as you alluded to in your setup, Pakistan has had a hedging strategy with regard to Afghanistan for much of the past 20 years. Publicly, they were cooperating with the United States and U.S. war effort in Afghanistan, principally through the provision of the so-called ground lines of communication and the air lines of communication, the latter of which has been important right up through the evacuation that we saw ending on August 31st and continues to be kind of a live issue. So you could, but on the other hand, clandestinely, they were supporting the Taliban principally by providing safe haven for the leadership of the Taliban in Pakistan, allowing fighters to have R&R and medical treatment in Pakistan, and occasionally, but at vital moments, providing some degree of support, whether tacit or substantive, to the Taliban. So you could argue that the Taliban victory was a strategy for Pakistan, a victory for Pakistan's hedging strategy. Certainly the presence of the ISI chief in Kabul shortly thereafter would so indicate, and the fact that you had Imran Khan, his initial comment was talking about Afghans having broken the shackles of slavery, and the foreign minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, has been calling for engagement with the Taliban regime, all of which suggests that they regard this, at least in some part, as having been a successful venture. But it seems to me that it is a Pyrrhic victory, and there are a lot of Pakistanis who would see it that way as well, for essentially four reasons. First is that Pakistan is now next to an imploding Afghanistan. The Taliban were very successful as an insurgency, but they had no capacity for governance. Even when they were an insurgency, they relied on the government's ability to deliver services in the areas that they conquered. There's been kind of a hybrid in many areas of Afghanistan for years, and now they have smashed that governance structure. So this is likely to be, there's already an economic collapse, there's likely to be a large-scale humanitarian crisis, and perhaps refugee flows into Pakistan. And over time, as the Taliban, if it retains its very harsh rule, is likely to generate instability, political instability. The second reason is that that Pakistan should be concerned is that the Taliban victory has given encouragement to Islamists within Pakistan, and you've already seen some activity at the Red Mosque in downtown Islamabad, sort of the central venue for Islamists. The third reason is that the Pakistan Taliban, the TTP, Tehreek Taliban Pakistan, now has a safe haven of sorts in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, is trying to preside over a peace process between the government of Pakistan and the TTP, but the Pakistanis have done that before with not very successful results. But I would say the fourth reason, and probably the principal reason, and the one that concerns us here today, that Pakistan, Pakistan's victory is less than resounding, is that Pakistan has now positioned itself as an intermediary between the Taliban and the rest of the world, and including the United States. Yet its leverage is vastly reduced. It is no longer the landlord for the Taliban, and is unlikely to be able to use its. It probably still has influence of the Taliban, but is unlikely to move the Taliban on its core agenda. Yet, I think Washington and others will expect Pakistan to be able to deliver the Taliban on questions of inclusive governance, humanitarian corridors, and especially on CT, on counterterrorism. And I think that's likely where things will get challenging for Pakistan over time. As Al-Qaeda regroups in Afghanistan, and I think there's very little doubt that to some extent it will, the question will be what Washington will ask of Pakistan in terms of addressing those questions when Pakistan has, as I said, reduced leverage. So the bottom line is that I think Pakistan would like to be done with Afghanistan. They'd like to be done with their forever war, which is more forever than ours. But I think Afghanistan is likely to dominate their relations with the US and the international community for some time to come. So why don't I stop there?
Outstanding. Thank you very much for framing the situation so concisely and cogently. And now, Medea, over to you. And I know that in addition to speaking to the same general question of where we are at this moment, you'll be bringing in some other considerations about how Pakistan's doing, its own domestic and broader regional challenges. And so the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to Ambassador Olson for opening us up with these remarks. I'll start off with where U.S.-Pakistan relations stand, but before that, I think Pakistan, in many ways, as Ambassador Olson said, has long sought a strategic depth in Afghanistan, and it may have come closer to achieving that long sought strategic depth in Afghanistan, but it is not going to be a simple outcome for Pakistan, and it's already seeing that. And the first reason, in my mind, is the issue of terrorism and extremism within Pakistan, and specifically for Pakistan, the rise of the TTP, the resurgence of the TTP. There were TTP prisoners that were released by the Afghan Taliban in August across Afghanistan, and they've increased their attacks in Pakistan's western areas on Pakistani security forces already. But this goes beyond that to other militant and jihadist groups and fundamentalist groups that may not even be violent, but more to an extremist mindset in Pakistan. And I can talk about that a little bit later as I talk about domestic issues. But I think Pakistan's relationship with the US now, post-Afghanistan, really just stands at a precipice. And this is a relationship that matters greatly to Pakistan. And I'll sort of detail or lay out the relationship as it stands now, 2 months now after the fall of Kabul. I think the mood in Washington, as we've seen over the last few weeks, is to figure out what went wrong in Afghanistan. And the role of Pakistan has come up repeatedly in congressional hearings with General McKenzie, General Milley, Secretary Blinken. They've been asked questions about the role of Afghanistan, and they've said the role of the Taliban sanctuary in Afghanistan, and they've said the role of Pakistan needs to be looked at. There are a number of Republican senators, 22 to be exact, who have proposed a bill saying that the role of Pakistan needs to be looked at and a report needs to be written on this. And they've proposed sanctions on the Taliban regime and any governments that have supported the Taliban regime. Pakistan is alarmed at this bill. I think overall in Washington, which has had reasons because of the ground lines of communication, because of the airlines of communication, because of Pakistan's cooperation on counterterrorism issues, to gloss over Pakistan's sanctuary for the Taliban, now there's less reason to look away. And so that will be examined. Pakistan, of course, wants a broad-based relationship with the US. It would like nothing more than to turn the page on Afghanistan. It says, and it's repeatedly said, it wants a relationship based on geoeconomics, on trade, on regional connectivity. But the US has not shown that it's interested. Certainly the Biden administration has not really shown that it's interested. And the relationship continues to be defined almost exclusively by Afghanistan. It's been the topic of discussion in a lot of interactions that have been happening between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who had their first meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly just last month. The meeting focused almost exclusively on Afghanistan. CIA Director Bill Burns has visited Pakistan twice over the last few months. The two national security advisors have met. But sort of amid all this interaction is the glaring lack of a phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Khan, which is somewhat inexplicable at this point, 9 months into the Biden administration. What America wants from Pakistan, up till August, was that Pakistan should put pressure on the Taliban to come to a peace deal with the Ghani government. That did not come to pass. The Taliban instead adopted a military strategy and took over. Now, Washington still wants Pakistan to put pressure on the Taliban to make their government inclusive, to have some concessions on women's rights, on girls' education, on human rights. And it also wants for Pakistan to not recognize the Taliban government, which Pakistan has not. But as Ambassador Olson also noted, Pakistan has concertedly been making the case for engagement with the Taliban, for the world to engage with the Taliban. And it's in a way sort of that it's proposing a more unconditional engagement than the US would want. I think the other thing the US is looking for is still over the horizon counterterrorism cooperation, something that's become more important post-August. And I think we can look at Director Burns' visit last month to Islamabad in that light. And General McKenzie also alluded to the airlines of communication, ground lines of communication, and their future in his congressional testimony. So I don't think, while the mood in Washington is grim, I don't think Pakistan gets cut off completely, not yet, because Washington still needs it for these couple of reasons I outlined. But I think there will be limited engagement with Pakistan, and will be based almost exclusively on Afghanistan. I'll just note a couple of things. One is the role of China. Pakistan's, of course, really close relationship with China doesn't really help it maintain, the kind of relationship it wants with the US. Pakistan has said that it doesn't want these two relationships to be zero-sum, but when the US is looking to, to its partnership with India, its relationship with India to counter China, Pakistan's close relationship with China doesn't really stand it in good stead. I will also note Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was in Pakistan last week, just after a trip to India. And in India, in an interview, she said that the trip to Pakistan was for a very specific, and I'm quoting here, a very specific and narrow purpose. We don't see ourselves building a broad relationship with Pakistan. And she was more diplomatic while in Pakistan, but may have somewhat undiplomatically in that interview in India given away where the Biden administration truly stands on Pakistan. I think my final point just on the US-Pakistan relationship is that the Biden administration, I think, has adopted a decidedly different tenor and tone towards Pakistan relative to the Trump administration, which had a very transactional approach to Pakistan, but which in the last 2 years of the Trump administration, because it was a different time, when peace talks and the peace process was sort of at the forefront of the strategy towards Afghanistan, that worked quite well for Pakistan. And Pakistan is really, sort of feeling certainly the cold shoulder when it comes to the Biden administration. And perhaps we can go to Bruce now, and I can come back to the question of the domestic situation after that.
Great, let's do that. And Bruce, over to you. I know this is a pretty sober and not particularly hopeful assessment of where U.S.-Pakistan relations stand that we've just heard from Medea. How do you feel about it? And is there an opportunity to avoid such a cold, limited relationship at this juncture in history?
Yes, thank you, Mike, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I agree with Ambassador Olson and the situation is blue. Unfortunately, I think that's missing something. I think we actually have an opportunity in U.S.-Pakistan relations today, really an opportunity that we haven't had in more than 4 decades. Since Christmas Eve 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, our policy towards Pakistan has been fixated on fighting wars in Afghanistan. First, the war against the communists and the Soviets, then the war against Al-Qaeda, and then the war against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. For 40 years, the imperative in US-Pakistan relations has been to keep the air and land and sea corridors open to get supplies to Afghanistan. Karachi was in many ways the key to America's ability to fight wars in Afghanistan, both in supplying the Mujahideen and then in supplying the NATO forces. We now have an opportunity. We don't need Karachi. We don't need to supply forces in Afghanistan. Whatever you think of how we got to this point, the reality is we're in a new world. We have an opportunity to deal with Pakistan in a holistic approach, not fixated by Afghanistan. Why does that matter? Well, you've alluded it to in your introduction. Pakistan is a country that matters a lot. This is the 6th largest country in the world in terms of population, with a very fast growing population. It is the 4th largest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world and the fastest growing nuclear weapons arsenal in the world. This is a country that not only has strategic nuclear weapons, but is developing tactical nuclear weapons. I would not be surprised at all to see Pakistan moving into the area of nuclear-powered submarines with Chinese help to deliver nuclear weapons to a much larger part of the globe. It has 2 neighbors, India and Iran, which the United States is very much interested in. It has hostile relations with India. It has rather good relations with Iran. If the United States wants to broker a deal with Iran, one of the pathways to get there could be through Islamabad. It has, of course, in China, a very close ally that has invested billions of dollars. Some of it is not real investment, some of it is phony, but nonetheless, it is China's #1 ally in the world. The United States and China are fated to be the dominant powers of the 21st century. Pakistan's relationship with China should matter very much to the United States. And last, but far from least, is the issue of terrorism. Pakistan is the home to numerous terrorist organizations, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Let's not forget where we found Osama bin Laden 10 years ago. In May of 2011, he was not hiding in a cave somewhere on the Afghan-Pakistan border. He was hiding in plain sight in a mansion in Abbottabad, less than a half a mile from the Pakistani equivalent of West Point. If you want to fight terrorism, Pakistan is going to be the battlefield. If you want to do it successfully, you're going to need to engage Pakistan on your side. The other reason I would say is that Pakistan is an incredibly volatile country. Go back to 2000, the beginning of this millennium. Pakistan was ruled by a military dictator, Pervez Musharraf. He was gradually brought down by popular demonstrations and sent off into exile. The leader of the opposition, Benazir Bhutto, was assassinated. Actually, it was the 2nd attempt on her life. She was assassinated, possibly with the assistance of the Pakistani intelligence service. There's still a lot of question marks about that. Another Pakistani Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, has been hounded out of the country and is now in exile in London. This is a very, very volatile political atmosphere. Who's in today could easily be in London tomorrow or Dubai. It's also a country with one of the largest Shia minorities in the Muslim world. I've never found someone who can give me a real hard number on what percentage of the Pakistani population is Shia, but it's quite considerable. It may be as much as a quarter or even a third. It's a country with a weak economy. The GDP per person is less than 2/3 than it is in neighboring India, and growth is anemic 2%. All of that should matter enormously to the United States, because an unstable Pakistan with nuclear weapons could be a real disaster for the world, particularly if it's supporting terrorist groups who want nuclear weapons. Let's remember that Pakistan has not only developed its own nuclear weapons arsenal, but it has been a proliferator. It has been the #1 proliferator of nuclear weapons to other countries. We've just had the passing of A.Q. Khan this week, the man who basically gave Libya an entire nuclear weapons kit. Unfortunately for us, the Libyans didn't know how to put it together. So we have an opportunity here to engage. Engagement doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean that we accept all of Pakistan's programs. It means that we, on some issues, are going to have sharp differences of opinion. But we will be able to influence their opinions because, as Medea has pointed out, the United States matters a lot to Pakistan. They need our support in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other places. The United States has leverage. It has been constrained from using that leverage for 40 years because of the wars in Afghanistan. It now can use it. Then let me say two more points. The worst case, I think it's a very realistic worst case, is that the Pakistani generals will say to themselves in the next 6 months, we've now defeated two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. It's time to now move on to the real enemy. And that enemy is India. And we need to increase tensions in Kashmir to force the Indians to withdraw from Kashmir. India is not going to withdraw from Kashmir. But we could rapidly see a situation develop in which two nuclear armed countries are on the brink of war. The last thing I would say is I've followed US-Pakistan relations for the better part of a half century. One thing does not work: sanctions. Sanctions will not work. Sanctions will be counterproductive. It may make you feel good to sanction Pakistan. Cutting off supplies of F-16s may make you feel really warm and fuzzy, but it isn't going to change Pakistani behavior. We have an opportunity. We should seize it. It doesn't mean falling in love. It means having a real working relationship with Pakistan, and that needs to start with Joe Biden calling Imran Khan.
Thank you, Bruce, for that excellent discussion. And now I want to go in reverse order back to Medea and then Rick to ask about Pakistan. And Bruce got at some of this too in terms of the demographics, the economics, the politics. One happy note, Bruce, I think you're the one that underscored this to me a few years ago when Pakistan actually did start having peaceful transitions of civilian rule, which we shouldn't lose sight of in the context of all the problems. So that's one hopeful sign. But Medea, I'd love to get your overall sense, and then yours, Ambassador Olson, about the state of Pakistan today, and then anything you might want to add, sort of one or two big policy ideas that the United States could consider that might speak to Pakistan's needs and perhaps help begin to rebuild the relationship if you think that's appropriate. So Medea, over to you first, please.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just touch on a few items. I think, Pakistan, as Bruce mentioned, it's a large country, it's a diverse country. It's a country that, with all of its problems, holds a lot of promise as well, especially in its youth, in its tech sector, which pales in comparison to the tech sector in neighboring India, but still is blossoming. So there's a lot that we could talk about, but I'll touch on four things. The first is civilian military relations. Pakistan's favorite pastime is to talk about this, and nothing really quite gets the rumor mill flowing in Islamabad like a purported rift between Imran Khan and the military, which I'll point out, and speculation is rife this week, that there is a rift over the appointment of the DG ISI. But it could well be that this comes to pass, but I'll point out that speculation has gone this way before, but this government has shown a remarkable ability to stay on the same page as the military. Imran Khan and General Bajwa, who's on a 3-year extension that is set to expire next November of 2022, work quite well together. They say repeatedly that they're on the same page, and we'll see if they continue to remain on the same page after this sort of round over the appointment of the DGISI. But I think Imran Khan might well be the first prime minister to complete a 5-year term in office. In the previous transitions that have happened from a civilian government to another civilian government through elections, the prime ministers were not able to complete their full term in office. But Imran Khan, because of what some call a hybrid setup, between the civilians and the military, where the military essentially control all aspects of foreign and security policy, especially when it comes to Afghanistan. But this setup is something that seems to be working. So that's the first point I'll make. The second point, something very worrisome is that the government has initiated talks with the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. As we mentioned, they've increased their attacks in recent weeks, and Imran Khan announced that the government has secretly begun talks with at least some factions of the TTP in Afghanistan. But I should point out that this was without taking parliament into confidence, and that peace talks that occurred 7 or 8 years ago between 2013 and 2014 and the Nawaz Sharif government failed miserably. This government has shown no interest in countering the narratives of extremism. It has often blamed the TTP's attacks on elements within Afghanistan as well as India. The beginning of talks saying that the TTP may be forgiven if they lay down arms is something that is akin to basically giving in to extremists without tackling any of the root causes of extremism that I spoke about and I wrote about in my book. So it's shown no indication that it understands those root causes or that it wants to tackle them in any way. The third thing I'll mention is sort of a little bit on CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and sort of overall on Pakistan's economy. Pakistan, had a slowdown like most countries with COVID, but it actually has done better with COVID in terms of sort of fewer deaths, 28,000 deaths in Pakistan, than neighboring India, neighboring Iran, as well as other countries, of course, that are its size. So the economy that slowed down is doing a little bit better now, not great. Imran Khan came into office promising deep sort of institutional economic reform. That has not happened 3 years in. But on China and CPEC, I wrote a short policy brief last year saying that Pakistan and China control the narrative on CPEC, painting it as positive at all costs. Well, some of that has started cracking. And people are now sort of wondering out loud what the terms of CPEC are and whether they really benefit Pakistan. And some of this is because there's been increased reporting on this, as well as research on it. But in Pakistan as well, now there are questions being raised about CPEC, and of course, China has complained publicly about the slow pace of CPEC, and it's worried about that. The final thing I'll mention is the government's control of the education system. It has done one major thing, which is proposed and adopted for some grades a single national curriculum. Imran Khan and his party basically say that the Pakistani education system is segmented between the elite who study in schools following a British curriculum and adopt Western values relative to the masses who study in the government school system. And he's attempted to roll out a uniform national curriculum, the single national curriculum, which has proven controversial. And one major element, which I think is very problematic, and I've talked about this, is the fact that it is attempting to do away with that British system, which actually was working quite well in training people, both in sort of rigor and critical thinking, as well as in tolerance. In my book, I had proposed that everybody in Pakistan should adopt some version of that curriculum. And now we have sort of a reversion or regression on that. And the final thing I'll say is, and something that has just been announced very recently, is a new religious authority which will oversee the curriculum and, again, aims to attack sort of anything that's against Western values and incorporate religion even more than it already has been in the curriculum. And as we know, and I've written about this in detail, there's quite a bit of it. So I think, there's a bit of evidence of, in this new Pakistan, as again, this government likes to call it, Naya Pakistan, evidence of focus on some misguided things rather than really focusing on economic progress and reform.
Thank you very much, Medea. And now, Ambassador Olson, I'd like to turn to you for any comments you want to make at this time, including on U.S. policy options. But let me if I could just add one sort of particular observation, which is listening to Medea, I'm struck at the Biden administration's apparent, almost slightly contemptuous attitude towards Pakistan, it would seem. And am I right in thinking that, and this is all speculative, but President Biden just sort of got sick of this part of the world? I mean, his decision to pull out of Afghanistan pretty abruptly, and his frustration with the Afghan political class, and now his frustration with Pakistan, seem to be all conflated into a general sense of, I just want to forget about this part of the world. I realize we didn't bring you on here to be an armchair psychologist for President Biden, but to the extent you have any insights about where this administration might be and whether that is a productive way to look at South Asia or potentially a hazardous one. Over to you, please.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, let's deal with that that part first. I mean, I think that yes, there is a great deal of AFPAC fatigue throughout Washington, and I think that one thing that's interesting is that Secretary Blinken, when he was up on testifying on the Hill last week, promised a Pakistan policy review. And my guess is that that will, in the way of interagency policy reviews, probably call for continued engagement, you know, with Pakistan and Afghanistan, perhaps through Pakistan. But I do think it's safe to say right now that, you know, I spent 34 years in the State Department, so forgive me for a little bit of inside baseball State Department speak, but I think where Pakistan is destined to wind up is as a sixth floor problem rather than a seventh floor problem. The seventh floor being where the secretary and the undersecretaries reside, and the sixth floor where the assistant secretaries, especially for regional affairs, reside. So I think Pakistan is going to be a sixth floor problem rather than a seventh floor problem, and not a White House problem. That's my guess how it's going to wind up. And the venue matters perhaps more than the actual content of the strategy. But let me take a step back here, because I really want to talk about the strategic significance of what the Biden administration has done. The justification that President Biden offered, apart from the sort of, you know, the specifics of the situation in Afghanistan and the inheritance he received from the previous administration with regard to Afghanistan, his strategic justification was to carry out the pivot to East Asia, long promised and long delayed. And what that means is that the focus for the US in the region is going to be Indo-Pacific strategy. That means, as we all know, an enhanced strategic partnership with India, not necessarily at the expense of Pakistan, but in the real world, choices will be made. And the fact is that there will be a cost to expanding our strategic partnership with India to maintaining a relationship with Pakistan, especially if Bruce is correct in his assessment that Pakistan may now shift to Kashmir and after the victory in Afghanistan. So, you know, what that suggests to me is that Pakistan is on the wrong side of the pivot from the perspective of Washington. And it is particularly the case because Pakistan is de facto an ally of China, one of about three in the world. I mean, it's right up there alongside North Korea and Myanmar. Never a formal ally, but it is very much aligned with China and has been for a long time. And as Medea pointed out, China is pumping a lot of assistance into Pakistan under the CPEC, at least 60 billion. So, to the extent that US foreign policy is now framed by strategic competition and not by counterterrorism. Again, counterterrorism, I think, is going to be important with regard to Pakistan. I agree with Bruce on that, but it's going to be a sixth floor issue, not a seventh floor issue. And I think that that is going to be the strategic frame in which Pakistan is going to be evaluated going forward. Now, you asked if there were some specific policy thinking that could be done. I mean, Pakistan's answer to all of this essentially is geoeconomics, that we should focus the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. Pakistan should focus its external relations in general on economics rather than geopolitics and military issues. The problem for the US is there's not much content there. While the US is the main export market for Pakistan, I think Pakistan is like the 59th market for us in terms of exports. It's negligible in terms of our own exports, and it's still a challenging environment for U.S. and international firms to invest in. So I think, just coming back to one of the things that Bruce mentioned, we do have a lot of potential leverage in various international economic fora, World Bank, IMF, and especially now the Financial Action Task Force, which has been very successful in getting Pakistan to clamp down on some of the Eastern-oriented terrorist groups, although remains to be seen how long that will last. I think the focus then should be for the US to let the IMF and the World Bank be unencumbered in their advice to the Pakistani government and frankly their conditionality, so that some of the underlying economic weaknesses of the Pakistani economy can be addressed, and that would allow geoeconomics to become a more serious proposition in terms of building a foundation for the US relationship with Pakistan over time. So why don't I stop there?
That's fantastic. So we've got about 20 minutes to go, and we've got a lot of audience questions, which I'm going to now try to group and then pose collectively to the panel. And maybe for this first group, we'll go in the original order of Rick, Medea, Bruce, and then maybe change it up. So the first set of questions really has to do with regional relationships, and you've all touched on them already. But there are some questions that want to ask you to sort of bore down a little more deeply on Pakistan, China, Pakistan, India, maybe even Pakistan, Iran, and the Russia dimension, and really explore any opportunities for US policy, which I think Bruce Rydell had alluded to earlier, some opportunities by which we could try to either take advantage of or weaken some of these relationships, depending on how they affect us. And this will probably work best if each of you focuses on one or two of the key countries, and that way complement each other's answers. So that's a batch of about 6 or 8 questions we got from the audience that I'm condensing into that one. And if we could start, please, Rick, with you.
Thanks, Mike. So let me just try a couple of these. First of all, on Pakistan and China, I think the key takeaway for the U.S. Here is: are we going to, in some sense, attempt to compete with China for Pakistan's affection, if you want to put it that way? I think that would probably be a bit of a mistake. I mean, China has much greater resources that it's made available. Something like $60 billion plus dollars for CPEC versus the total U.S. Civilian assistance, which was under 10 billion. Although ours was grant and the Chinese is primarily debt. But I think it would be a mistake to try to compete directly in that area. But the U.S. does have some advantages. It has great soft power still in Pakistan, I would say. I mean, most, certainly amongst the political elite, they all want to have a house in the U.S. And send their kids to American schools and have one of their kids have an American passport. So, that's something that we can play on. And I would think that we want to maintain the educational exchanges, both on the military side with IMET, the military education program, but on the civilian side as well. We've historically had a large Fulbright program, and I think we should continue to maintain that. That's our real forte. On Pakistan and Iran, Bruce mentioned the intriguing possibility of Iran perhaps, Pakistan and Islamabad perhaps being helpful for a deal with Iran. That is intriguing. Of course, Pakistan is very proud of the fact that it played a role in the initial opening to China way back in 1971. Henry Kissinger spent a long weekend in Natia Gali, north of Islamabad, and actually flew to meet Zhou Enlai from Pakistan on the first secret mission. And I suppose something like that is possible with the JCPOA, but the problem here is that Pakistan has always had to straddle its relationships in the Gulf with its relationship with Iran. So in other words, I think much will depend on where the Saudis and the Emiratis come down on the question of the JCPOA. If they're okay with the JCPOA going forward, and up until now, they've had a lot of skepticism about JCPOA. They want it expanded and turned into a broader regional pact or an agreement that addresses regional issues. If they're opposed to it, it's going to be very hard for Pakistan, I think, given the enormous role that Saudi Arabia and UAE play financially with regard to Pakistan. But it's certainly worth exploring. So why don't I stop there? There's much that could be said on India, but we can come back to that, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. Medea, over to you.
Thanks. I'll start off with China and Pakistan as well. And I agree with Ambassador Olson. You know, the U.S. doesn't need to compete with China for Pakistan's affections. And I think we should take Pakistan for its word when it says that Pakistan does not want to look at these two relationships as zero sum. So I think in the Trump administration, Alice Wells, when she was talking about CPEC, she talked about sort of how it might have been a debt trap for Pakistan, sort of trying to make this a zero sum relationship. I don't think the Biden administration, because it's sort of not been paying as much attention perhaps to Pakistan, has made that pitch. And I think, as I mentioned, the sheen of CPEC is wearing off a little bit in Pakistan. And the China-Pakistan relationship, while overtly and ostensibly extremely close, and often, talked about in very flowery language in both countries, is not seamless. China, for instance, is quite worried about the security situation in Pakistan because it impacts Chinese investments in Pakistan, including and as well as Chinese workers who are working in Pakistan. The TTP has been attacking Chinese workers and Chinese investments in Pakistan, and so that's a worry. And again, on the terms of CPEC, that's a worry. So that's something that we can explore as the U.S. and invest in Pakistan. Right? Doesn't need to be at the same level as China, but any investment would be appreciated. And here I'll turn to a point on sort of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I think in some ways, the onus is really on Pakistan to do more. And Pakistan dislikes this term, do more. But here I don't mean do more on Afghanistan, do more on security, but I mean do more on the geoeconomics, because Pakistan has been offering up geoeconomics as its sort of catch-all favored phrase, but it needs to offer something more than words. And again, Ambassador Olson alluded to this, it needs to offer up real economic incentives for the U.S. to invest. And again, this is easier said than done, and it requires sort of the hard work of sort of economic reform and to make an investment climate hospitable to the U.S., but that's something on which it can work. And if it offers the U.S. real economic incentives, I don't see why America would look away. The third thing, I'll just pick up and make a quick point on the Iran angle. Before Pakistan had started this geoeconomics pitch, it was making this sort of foreign policy pitch for itself. This was sometime last year. Look, we can be a mediator between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between Iran and the US. Shah Mahmood Qureshi was overtly pitching himself as such. Imran Khan said as much to President Trump. Pakistan seems to have not made that pitch to President Biden, and maybe President Biden won't listen to it. But that is something that it was, actually explicitly pitching, and perhaps could be somewhere where it might be useful. Final point on India. I think the mood in Pakistan is not to do more when it comes to India in terms of improving the relationship until there's something that's done about the August 5th, 2019 change on Kashmir's autonomy. Any moves that were made on sort of reinstating trade with India have been blocked by political parties within Pakistan, including the ruling party, because of the strong sentiments that Pakistan's politics and public opinion has over Kashmir. And so the sentiment really isn't there in Pakistan to do more, to improve ties with India, but certainly in India, there isn't sentiment either to do anything positive with Pakistan. And in some sense, the problems in the relationship now are defined for both by the other. Pakistan always says it wants to talk about Kashmir first. India always says it wants to talk about terrorism first, and they basically don't come any closer to this. But I think that the mood domestically in both countries is perhaps as far as it's ever been from them aiming at any sort of rapprochement.
Well, that's unwelcome to hear, but appreciate your honesty and bluntness. Bruce, over to you with the same set of questions, please.
Well, I will pick up where Medea rightly left off, which is it's all about Kashmir, and the mood is terrible on both sides. And in some ways, Imran Khan is the most anti-Indian Pakistani politician in high office that I would say we have ever seen. But we should also take a realistic look at the Indians. Medea alluded to the 2019 decision to strip Kashmir of its special status. That was not helpful. Certainly did not help to build a Kashmiri sense that they had a rightful place in India. The Modi government has become increasingly Hindu-centric. That's, of course, what it was elected on. But in practice, that has meant the growth of Islamophobia in India today. I'm certainly a strong supporter of a solid, important bilateral U.S.-Indian relationship. I played some role in helping that to start in the second Clinton administration. But I don't think that means that we turn a blind eye to some of the things, some of the policies that India has pursued. That doesn't mean endorsing Pakistan 100% or even 50%. But it does mean speaking out honestly about what's going on in Kashmir and trying to nudge the law. We all know that India is not going to give up. That's not in the cards. But can India be persuaded to treat Kashmir in ways that improve the life of the Muslim majority in the South? That should be something. Last thing I will say very briefly is I've talked about an opportunity here with Pakistan. Let me make it concrete. The administration is talking about having a summit for democracy. Pakistan is a democracy. It's a flawed democracy. Tell me one that isn't a flawed democracy. But it is a democracy. By the standards of the Muslim world, Pakistan has one of the most vibrant democracies that exists. Elections really matter. They should be invited. That should be the topic of President Biden's phone call to Imran Khan, inviting the Summit for Democracies. Not to do that will send a very, very dangerous message, not only to the Imran Khan government, but to the people of Pakistan and their aspirations.
Fantastic. And that picks up where one of the remaining questions wants to go, which is the phone call. And so what we'll do now is have one final round and maybe just reverse order. So Bruce, Medea, Rick to finish, please, with a couple of minutes for each of you. And let me just tick off the questions that are still outstanding. One is, when should that phone call occur and what should its main motivation or substance be? Bruce, you've already answered that, but others may want to chime in. Second is a more philosophical question. I don't know if it came from a Pakistani, but it's certainly a fair question, which is, does the United States appreciate enough what Pakistan has done for us over the years? And maybe dating back, as all three of you know very well, but some of our viewers may not remember quite so well, which is how Pakistan essentially helped us win the Cold War by routing all those supplies through the Mujahideen in the 1980s that defeated the Soviet Union, the way Bruce alluded to in his opening. And then finally, a couple more questions about internal governance within Pakistan that you've touched on, but maybe there's more to say. One would have to do with whether groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba have essentially become Frankenstein's monsters, no longer as easily controlled by the ISI, and therefore potentially even more dangerous. And then a related question, although again, you've been touching on it, is the state of civil-military relations in Pakistan today, and irrespective of explicit and specific personalities, is there a general trend line towards greater civilian control of the military, even if that's a slow process that certainly hasn't yet reined in the ISI altogether under proper civilian authority, as we would define it perhaps in this country? So that's a lot. I don't expect each of you to answer all four, but a couple of minutes each, please, starting with Bruce.
Certainly. I've already said what I think the president should talk about, an invitation to democracies. But he should also talk about Afghanistan. If we want to get out more of our allies and friends in Afghanistan, rescue them, well, the only place you can rescue them from is Pakistan. Pakistan's involvement will be crucial. Particularly if we're not going to have a direct dialogue with the Taliban, we will need Pakistan's support. Terrorism. We talk a lot about over the horizon. Well, the horizon here is Pakistan. If you want to fly drone missions to target terrorist camps in Afghanistan or in the Afghan border, you're going to have Pakistani approval. Otherwise, they will just simply shoot them down. And they would have every legal right to do so. So there's a conversation that needs to take place. Much of it will be detailed and can be done on the 6th floor, as an ambassador has noted. But it sure helps the 6th floor if they can say, as you remember from the phone call between the president and the prime minister, you can build a lot on that in a hurry. And I'll lastly throw out, I think some people are going to think this is really out of the wild, but the United States, starting under President Trump, but continuing under President Biden, has been urging the Muslim world to come to grips with the reality of the state of Israel. Well, Pakistan and Israel developing a relationship would be a huge accomplishment for any administration. I don't think anyone's tried. I don't think it has a very good chance of success, particularly with Imran Khan as prime minister. But I think it's an idea that ought to be kept out there in the minds of Pakistan American watchers for the future.
Thank you, Bruce. Over to you, Medea.
Thanks. I completely agree with Bruce. I think calling to invite Imran Khan to the Summit of Democracies is a great idea. Imran Khan, in fact, in his first tweet congratulating President Biden, or then candidate Biden, for winning the election in November last year, mentioned the Summit of Democracies. It would have the additional benefit of bolstering Pakistan's civilian government when the U.S. often ends up bolstering Pakistan's military because it finds it easier to work with Pakistan's military. So inviting Imran Khan to a Summit of Democracies, showing that Pakistan's democracy is important to the U.S. would be important. I think, and I'll just mention one indicator of that. Secretary of Defense Austin, for instance, called General Bajwa, the Chief of Army Staff. General Bajwa is not Secretary Austin's counterpart. Pakistan's defense minister is hardly even known. Many in Pakistan don't even know his name. And so, that would be a very important and a good way to engage with Pakistan. I think the second thing I'll mention is that it would be useful, as others have done in the past, for the U.S. to acknowledge that Pakistan, of course, has had its own terrorism problem and continues to have it over the last 20 years. And Mike, you asked about whether we appreciate Pakistan. I think the narratives, and I've written about this, the narratives of both countries continue to see past each other completely. But acknowledging that Pakistan has suffered at the hands of terrorists, and many lives of Pakistani security forces as well as civilians have been lost in the last 20 years is important. On the Lashkar-e-Taiba and internal governance, I think the Financial Action Task Force has so far been the most useful tool to control the Lashkar-e-Taiba, for the Pakistani government to take action against the Lashkar-e-Taiba. I think the trick for the Biden administration is to figure out whether Pakistan just stays on the gray list forever, and that's how to make that control over or that action against the Lashkar-e-Taiba permanent. But that gray list forever on the Financial Action Task Force is starting in Pakistan to make people very wary. People think it's politics. And so, what is the right tool to get Pakistan to take sustained action against the Lashkar-e-Taiba if the Financial Action Task Force isn't it? I think that's a challenge. The final thing on CivMil, I'll just very quickly say that I think as a process, I don't think CivMil is moving in the right direction. But in this current government, with these personalities, it seems to be on the same page. And I'll end there.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Rick, over to you for the last word of the day.
Yeah, thanks very much. First, on the question of the phone call, let me say that I completely endorse Bruce's idea that the first phone call should be to invite to the Summit of Democracies. But my prediction is that the first phone call will be about either maintaining or reopening, or however you have to characterize it, the airline of communication, the boulevard over Pakistani territory, for some operational counterterrorism need. On CivMil relations, I'm not so sanguine. I think that this government prided itself on being a hybrid arrangement. That is to say that Imran Khan was close to and able to speak for the military, but that came at the cost of increased military role even in traditionally civilian areas like the economy. And without getting too far into the weeds on this current kerfuffle going on in Islamabad right now about the reappointment or non-reappointment of the ISI chief, just for everyone, there are a couple of things the timelines are really important. A year from now in 2022, the Army chief will either retire or be reappointed for an unprecedented third term. And then in May of 2023, Imran Khan's government will be up for re-election, assuming Imran survives through, which I agree with, he probably will. So that's the timeline that people are looking at. And the current ISI chief needs to have a core command in order to be considered for promotion to the Army chief. That's what this issue is all about. Whether or not Fayez Hamid is actually given a core command, which makes him eligible to replace Bajwa, or whether Bajwa is going to be extended. So, it'll be very interesting to watch this over the course of the next year. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Team, fantastic. Learned so much. I'm very grateful. And we're grateful to everyone who watched and tuned in today. You'll be able to see this, of course, on the website if you want to watch again. Transcripts should be up pretty soon as well. So on behalf of everybody at Brookings and USIP, signing off and thanking you with best wishes for the rest of the day.